Hello and welcome back to my surgery. This is a beginner's watercolour series. If you have landed here because you're looking for something more advanced, this probably isn't the series of videos for you. This video follows on from my surgery episode 1, in which we did a colour wheel and looked at basic colour theory, and my surgery episode 2, in which we did a really basic seascape. What we're going to do in this episode is come a little bit further inland. We're going to do a beach and some sea behind it. And I'm going to do this on a square of watercolour paper. I haven't got a perfect square here. I've kind of roughly got it. It's about 7 inches by 7 inches. It's actually slightly wider than it is tall. I was going to do this in a portrait shape, but due to the limitations of how I'm filming this, to be able to get the colour mixing and everything in, I've had to crop it and make it smaller, which is absolutely fine. Small paintings are often a little bit quicker, a little bit easier to do. Now, I've said to you previously about watercolour paper in the first few episodes. This is a cold press paper. I'm using Bockingford paper today, but you can use the papers that I've recommended in the previous 2 episodes. They will work just as well. It's just that I had a piece of this already cut, so I thought I'd use it. I'm not using my Cotman paints today, but you have them and you should use them. Today I'm using some tube paints, and the only reason I'm using those is it allows me to mix on screen so you can see what I'm doing a bit more easily. And these are professional quality paint, but if you do this with amateur paint, or I should say student paint, or even a budget paint, you're going to get similar effect. It may not be perfectly the same, but it will be similar. If you're using half pans, just wet them in advance like you normally do and do all your mixing in the same way you normally would. Because I'm using paint from a tube that I haven't dried down before use, I will be able to just use tiny amounts of it in a lot of water to make the similar kind of washes that you would experience. And I'm not using colours exactly from the recommended set of 7 or 8 colours I told you would probably need for this series. And I'll just go through what's different. I've got an ultramarine. You have an ultramarine. I've got a phthalo blue green shade, which in Cotman is called intense blue. So you know about those, they're fine. Burnt sienna, you know about, that's fine. I've got a permanent rose. You may have a permanent alizarin crimson or alizarin crimson or permanent rose or quinacridone rose. I said that any one of those 4 are acceptable. And quinacridone rose and permanent rose are actually the same paint, just given different names. And I'm using permanent rose from Winsor & Newton, which is quinacridone rose. I'm using a colour we haven't used yet, which is raw sienna. So we have burnt sienna and raw sienna, and what they're made of, or what they were made of historically, is soil from an area of Italy that was either used as is, raw sienna, kind of yellow and clayish, or it was baked and that gave the more orange burnt sienna. And I'm using that as my yellow. So today I've got 2 blues, a cool red. So I've got a warm blue, a cool red, and an earth yellow. And then I've got an earth red burnt sienna as well. So that's my little palette that I'm using. Brush wise, I'm using some slightly different brushes to normal. I've got my 8 and 12 round synthetics. I've also got a size 4 round in case I need it, and I've got a size 2 round on standby here as well. And I've got this brush you won't have seen before. You can get these made of goat, you can get them made of synthetic. This one's made of squirrel. This is a size 0. It's what's called a squirrel mop. Now don't confuse that for a standard mop, which is a huge brush. A squirrel mop, whether it's made of squirrel or synthetic, it's always called a squirrel mop, is a very specific type of brush. And I might use this, I might not. I find them useful for painting clouds, so I might use it, I might not. I've also got, because I'm working with tube paints, a pipette. If you don't have one, just use a drinking straw, put it into water, put your finger over the end and pull it out, and you can use that to carry water around. I'm using it today for one thing, and that's just to add water to my palette. And I'm mixing on what's called a slab palette here. This is a porcelain one, but you can get plastic ones. Just use whatever you have. I'm just using this because it makes filming easier. And I have this enormous brush, which is called a hake brush. It's made of goat hair and it's Japanese. I'm just using that because I can put water on very quickly, but you've got a Skyflow brush if you bought the brushes I recommended to you a while back, and you can and should use that. Now I'm just going to move my paints around a little bit because I want to get these put out, and what we're painting today is relatively straightforward. I'm going to talk a little bit about composition. I'm going to talk a little bit about colour, and what we're really going to have as our takeaway from this is everyone's painting is going to look really quite different, but that's almost the beauty of painting watercolour, that no two paintings are ever the same, even by the same artist. We're going to be doing a sort of not quite sunset, but it's a late evening or an early evening day at the beach. I'm not going to paint any people. I might, I might need to paint people to balance the composition out a little bit, but I'm not intending to paint people. Now, I'm not going to get any of the burnt sienna, the deep orange, out because I don't think I'm going to need it yet. So I've just got out the 4 colours. I've got the ultramarine, phthalo, blue-green shade, permanent rose, and raw sienna. And I'm just going to add from my clean water, I'm just going to add a couple of drops of water to each of the palettes, and I'll be adding water in that way. Some people add it with a brush. I don't like to. I like to do it that way. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a wash out of phthalo blue. And to do this, you actually need a lot of water. So I'm using all that water in there will soak into my brush, and that's intentional. I need a really wet brush to stop the paint just sticking to it because we don't want much. So with a very wet brush, and I'm not worrying that it's going over into the next well because I can just pull that out with a bit of tissue. Must make sure there's no lumps. Must make sure it's nicely mixed in, pushing out all the lumps. And I don't want it too intense. You can see there where it's on the porcelain, you can see what kind of consistency it is. And I'm washing out my brush, and I always use a really big jar of water to wash brushes because I like to dilute out the paint so they wash quickly. And then I have a small jar of clean water, and I'll be changing that frequently. Now let me just get some paper towel. Just using kitchen paper. Some people like to use tissues, individual ones. I don't. I like cheap kitchen paper. The cheapest you can get hold of is the best for watercolour because you don't want anything too complex. Now in our previous video when we did a seascape, we blotted out clouds. We painted them on and lifted them out, and then we put some shadow in. This time we're not even going to paint them, we're just going to sort of leave them. I also need a wash of permanent rose, so just take up some more water. And again, it doesn't matter if a little bit of the blue kind of climbs over the fence and gets in with the pink. It's not really a problem considering they're going to be used in close proximity, and that one can be a bit stronger. It doesn't really matter because we can always dilute it out later if we need to. So let me clean off that brush, and always remember when you mix a neat tube paint, wet your brush really thoroughly first, otherwise all that happens is your brush picks up a big gooey lump of paint that you then can't shift. Now I'm going to wet the paper, and if I don't drop my brush first, do excuse me while I pick my brush up. Okay, I'm going to wet the paper, and I'm going to use a hake brush to do that. Now I'm going to wet the upper 2/3 roughly. I'm not going to draw a line, but let's imagine there is going to be roughly where the surface of the land is. The horizon will probably be slightly, no, that's going to be, sorry, the horizon is going to be there. So we need to wet everything above that area. And I'm going to do that by using my hake brush, which I can dip into large volumes of water. And that allows me to wet quickly, really because I'm lazy. There's no real sort of need for me to wet it this quickly. There's no kind of technical reason for it. It's just speed, because I'm very lazy. And obviously, if you're working, tape your paper down, stretch the paper. If you want to look in the iCards, you can learn how to stretch paper. Stretching the paper is the best thing you can do. If not, just tape it down around the edges, and that will give you nice, neat edges on the finished painting, which always makes it come together and look so much more professional. So once you put the water on with your Skyflow brush or your Hake brush, make sure it's even, and you want to make sure it's shiny all over. And then we're just going to kind of leave it for a moment to start to sink in. If you're using a hard size paper like Arche for some mad reason, a beginner shouldn't really be using that kind of paper. I don't think you get any value from it. I think that as a beginner, you're spending a lot of money on a paper you don't really feel the benefits from. You'll need to let this soak in and then apply another layer if you're using that kind of paper, because they eat water really quickly. So I'm now taking a wet brush. I've wetted it with clean water, and I'm rolling it in that wash so that I'm almost kind of partially diluting. And I want to apply this in a diagonal this way, in a sweep. And then I'm going to roll again and apply another sweep and another. And the idea is that on this wet paper, this phthalo blue green shade is going to wick out and sort of in the negative space form clouds. Try not to brush it too much, just put paper on, what we call dropping in. Just drop in the water, the paint into the water, and then just let the rest of it happen. And if you find there's any pale areas, just drop in some more colour. And then wash your brush off. And while that's doing its thing, because we need to let it soak and let it move around, with a wet brush again, roll into the pink, and in this area underneath, first a horizontal line and then another couple of diagonals. We don't want this one to sort of bleed in the same way, but we don't want it too intense, which is why we put it on and let it spread a little bit, and make a pink triangle. And that pink triangle is going to be where the sun is setting. Don't worry if it kind of bleeds over the edge a little bit. All you need to do is take a clean wet brush and just go along, and that will just slightly move it all downwards a tiny bit. You'll see this is forming cloud-like patterns now, which is really nice, but we're going to have to let this dry completely before we can continue. So you might want to leave this an hour or two and let it really dry. I don't recommend using a heat gun on it, because if you do that, you won't get the benefit of the paint spreading naturally into wet paper and really doing what watercolour is all about, which is having that beautiful effect in the wet paper. So if you want to save time, heat gun it. I don't recommend it. If you do find you've got any pooling, like I've got here, this dark red patch here, that's because a pocket's formed on the paper. Just take a wet paper towel, slightly damp paper towel, not dry, and lift out a little bit of that colour. If you just lift out just a little, and then take your brush and just apply a tiny bit to fill the gap, that will take away some of that pooling. You might need to repeat that a couple of times, but that will take away the excess water without taking away the colour. Similarly, if at the edges you've got problems of too much water, squeeze out all the water from your brush, twist the brush into a point, and then just run that dry, thirsty brush up the edge. Always go from the light colour into the dark, and then you won't get any cross-pollination issues. This area here is going to be the land, and we're going to paint in some sea actually over some of that pink, so the pink has to dry completely. We can make our wash up and start painting in the land while it dries, but we will have to leave a gap. So I'm putting in some water, and I'm taking that raw sienna with a wet brush again, And this can be a difficult one to disperse, but it should make a nice earthy yellow. It's not really a brown, it's a yellow. And take that, and then onto dry paper, we're going to paint in so that we leave a triangle that way this time. So put this onto wet on dry technique now, and just leave a gap at the top. Don't go all the way up to the edge of the pink, because that's where we're going to paint the sea. And the reason we're going to kind of let that tail off is we're going to have some water coming onto the beach. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to just put a very faint area out there, because we can then glaze over it and that will make it a little bit more realistic. So if you want to add a little aide-memoire, just add a mark here and here. You can do it with paint, it's okay to do it, to remind yourself that this area is going to have water over it. And the gap at the top is where we're going to put the sea behind the beach. And we might want to add another layer or two of the sandy kind of colour in time. We might want to build it up a little bit, but we're going to have to let the whole thing dry completely now. And it's really difficult to do because you really want to touch it and poke around with these things, and you might get little marks that you don't like, and there's a temptation to touch it. Just don't. If you've got your paints out here, you can just leave them. All we have to do to regenerate them is just add some more water or mist them or whatever. You could put cling film over them, but to be honest, I think you're best just to leave them, and we'll come back to it. So let's leave this and let it completely dry. I'm going to be leaving this probably for about 3 or 4 hours because I want it absolutely completely dry. And you know when it's dry by putting the back of your hand on it, and if it feels the same temperature as dry paper at the edges, you know it's completely dry. If it feels remotely cold, it's not dry yet. So let's let that background wash just sit now and let the watercolour wick into the paper and do its work. And I'll join you back here in a few hours where we'll continue our painting. Okay, welcome back. I've actually left this to dry for 24 hours because I wanted to get it completely dry to be able to show you... Oh, drop a brush again. I wanted to show you a couple of things. One is that when it is dry, the paper will flatten back down again. So this is now completely flat. It did buckle and bow a bit when it was wet, but it's now flattened. What you should be able to see is that we've got these nice wispy clouds that have formed on their own. So we didn't paint those in. We painted in some rough streaks and left white gaps. And we now have clouds. They look a bit pale on the camera, but I'll do some close-ups at the end. And you can see we've got this kind of red area here, which is where the sun's setting. Now, a few notes on composition. There's all sorts of rules on composition. One is the rule of thirds, where if you divide your picture roughly into 3 in each direction, if you want to make something a focal point, you put it on one of those 2 lines, a third in from either edge and a third up from the bottom or a third down from the top. So in this case, those intersections would be roughly here and over here. And we're going to put something over here as a focal point. When I was setting up this image, I made a point of these being diagonal lines, and I said we put in where some water coming over the sand in a diagonal here, and we made a mark. So that would go like this. What that's doing is another rule of composition, which is to point towards your focal point. So with the focal point over here, if we've got lines kind of doing this, it draws the eye towards that focal point. So it'll end up with a pleasing composition regardless of how this ends up kind of looking. Now, let me find where my pipette, my dropper, has gone. Unfortunately, I was filming some other stuff while this was drying, and I've moved everything. So let me just see if it's dropped. Yep, dropped on the floor. See, I can always find things. It may look messy. So I'm just putting in some water back onto those washes that I had, and I'm not going to sort of dilute them. And I'm going to add a bit more because we want some ultramarine now, so we're going to want that. And you'll know one thing with this painting is there's not really any mixing so far, but we're going to have some mixing later on. So again, wetting my brush, picking up a little bit of ultramarine, mixing it in. I'm not worrying about that little bit of phthalo blue creeping over. It won't matter. And an important point when you are mixing is to add little by little, because you can always add more, but it's really hard to dilute. So I've got a reasonably dark blue there, that's ultramarine. I'm just going to rinse off that brush, wet it again with clean water, and just mix up this phthalo blue to the same concentration we had it for the sky. And I'm going to add a little bit more of the phthalo blue paint because I want it darker, because the sea should be darker than the sky, slightly darker in this case. And I want to talk a little bit about light sources while I'm doing this. If you think about the setting sun that we can see as red, that means the sun is actually kind of here somewhere. So the light is coming from the side. So if we have any objects, they've got to be dark on this side, light on this side, and that light is a very red light. It's going to be a very pink shadow that we see. So I'm going to add a little bit more of that permanent rose, that quinacridone rose, to darken that wash up a little bit more, because we're going to need that for adding light. And again, I'm going to paint some stuff, we're going to let it dry, and we'll carry on. You might find that re-wetting raw sienna needs a little bit more effort than the other colours, because it's got such large grains, it's really just a suspension and it will sink. So before you use it, sort of lift it up again. Now I'm going to take a little bit of that, because this sand is quite pale, and if the light's coming from that side, we're going to have a natural area of shadow. So I'm going to take some of that wash and I'm just going to gently bring in a little bit of darkness, again following those parallels so that we've got something pointing upwards again, just so that we've got the hint of a little bit of darkness there, and that will dry with slightly darker shadow at that end of the beach where the sun's over there and we've got a little bit of darkness. Now I want to add the sea, so I'm taking my number 8 brush, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do alternating use of phthalo blue and French ultramarine. Now some people, myself included, like to mix the two together physically when we're doing the sky, but in this case I'm not going to. I'm going to do them in alternating rows. So I'm going to start a little bit higher up, so I'm actually going to cover over some of the blue and the pink, and that's okay. Now because the sun's over here, we're going to leave some white gaps at this end, and those white gaps will be where the sunlight is reflecting on the water. But to do that, we're going to let colour show through from below. Don't worry if the top's not straight, because it never is. You always have to tidy it up. That pink showing through is going to give us quite a natural reflecting sunset. I'm not cleaning the brush, going straight into phthalo blue and doing underneath and letting it bleed up. Now it will bleed into that wet sand if I'm not careful, and it just has, very slightly. The rationale for doing sort of alternating colours is that you build a little bit of texture into an otherwise flat scene. The reason I'm not washing my brush in between changing the colours is a very simple one. We don't want them to look too much like separate colours. And I'm painting off the edge because it doesn't matter. And I'm going to put in one more layer, so I've got not quite a 4th row, because we don't want them to look like stripes, obviously. You don't want it to look too deliberate. And I'm just taking that slightly damp brush and just merging across the lines between the colours. Now what you get is that top row of ultramarine will granulate. If you don't know what granulating is, you can look in the iCards and watch my video on what granulation is, and that will allow some of that pink to show through, because in the distance the sea would have a pink cast from that sunset. I'm just going to take a tiny bit more of it and just join up these gaps here. Because we don't want them to be too big. And we're going to have to let the sea dry down now. Meanwhile, we're going to want to put some water over this sand. So to do that, we're going to make a mix, and we're going to use the pink to do it with. So in this one here, which has got a little bit of leakage in it, so I'm just wetting that with a wet brush and drying it out. You shouldn't worry too much about minor amounts of colours kind of merging like that, because it actually works quite well. I mean, I'm not worrying about that little mix there because we can pick that out later. All we have to do there is just add a little bit of water and blot. Gone, problem solved. If you do get a little bit of colour leaking into the next one, all it does is it kind of unifies things, so it's not something to really worry about. I'm going to pick up some of that pink at the consistency that it already is, because it's pretty much okay, and take a dot of phthalo blue, and a dot, because phthalo blue is very strong, so we're adding tiny bits, and I've got a very, very, very pale, washy, almost grey purple. It's really very pretty, and following that mark I made earlier for where we'd have water over the sand, I'm going to put it in, but I'm going to put it in following that diagonal, and we're going to have little gaps and we're going to have little rivulets, and it's not going to be perfectly neat, and the sand has got to show through because it is wet sand, it's not water. It's picking up a lot of reflection from the sky, so it's coming out all sorts of colours. It's not coming out sort of perfect blue, it's quite grey. And those little gaps will sort of fill in later. You can go right up to the sea, even if the sea's slightly wet. The merging of the colours will actually just unify things again. Very slight unification will happen. And I'm just going to pop a little bit more of that raw sienna over this end of the beach. Now you'll see the rest of the beach looks a little bit bland at the moment. There's all sorts of things we can do to remedy that. One of them is to make our mix much stronger. And Lindsay the Frugal Crafter, I'm going to do some spattering. Well, I'm not. You can do spattering, you just take your brush and hit it on your finger and make some speckles in this area. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to add some droplets, because when they dry, they'll just give a little bit of texture to that very flat beach, very, very bland area of sand. To do that, really, you want to make your wash a lot darker and work with quite a dark wash if you can. And what I've done before, and I'll do it with this one, is take a piece of clean kitchen towel, and when it's sort of been on there a little while, dab some of it off, but not all of it. And that will help, because you don't want spots, you want it just to give a little bit of texture, and that will help make it a little bit more variable and a little bit less bland. Now I want to add off in the distance here our focal point, which is going to be a little rock, quite a big rock, the sort of rocks that have a name. They're usually called, you know, the something stone or whatever. To do that, I'm going to use this up here with the addition of some burnt sienna to make a colour which we call Jane's Grey. Some people call it shadow. And we're going to add some pink to it because it's got pink shading on one side. So I'm going to take some burnt sienna and I'm going to mix it straight in. And that gives me a brown, a lovely rich brown. So you can make browns or greys, you just add more brown or more burnt sienna or more ultramarine. I'm going to add some ultramarine and get it really very, very neutral. I want it really very cold. There we go. And I can paint in this little rock using a relatively dry brush just below the horizon. You don't want it on the horizon. Really, you need to wait till this is dry, and if you can, if you're impatient, just take paper towel, dab out the area around the rock, and then you can paint the rock in. Now this is going to granulate like crazy, so it's a really good mix for doing. I've decided it's going to be humpback shape. You can make yours any shape you like. Stir this mix before you use it because it has a habit of settling, and make sure the brush is really dry so that you get a really dark mix. Now I'm not putting it on the right hand side because I want there to be some pink on that side. adding a bit more blue to darken this down and cool it, and putting that in, dropping that into the wet paint on the shaded side of the rock. Now the rock would reflect in the sea, so we'll add a reflection later, but we need to pinken that up a little bit. So I'm going to take quite a bit of that quinacridone violet and mix it into it. And this gives a mixture that I call shadow, which is French ultramarine, burnt sienna and quinacridone rose, and I mix the three together and put it straight in my palette like this. It gives the most glorious granulation, and you can make it almost black by adding more of these two. And then when it dries, you can just see the pink through it. So I'm going to put that in on the sunset side of the rock, the bits that would be facing over there. And now we want to add a bit of reflection, so I'm going to take a wet brush, roll it in that mix so that it's pretty dilute. It's a good way of not having to make a dilution, is just put a wet brush into it and you take up a smaller amount. And I'm just going to spot into that blotted area just the faintest of reflections. Now don't worry, there's an immediate sort of panic because it rushes into the wet paint and you think, oh, I've lost resolution, it doesn't look like a rock anymore. When we come to our last step and do a tidy, we will tidy that, make the sea straight because the sea's at an angle at the moment, and we will kind of deal with that. Now I've got a bit of a backflow over here. Teachable moment, as Mrs. Vyrick, the frugal crafter, says. Some of that blue has bled down, so I'll just blot. Note the raw sienna underneath doesn't lift. If you watch my video on granulation, that covers lifting as well. So I can rectify that. I'll just take some of that mix, repaint it over the top, and then I'll take a tiny bit of that phthalo blue and put it in a little bit further up, and that will bleed down. Because remember, this is a beach. It's got a horizon of its own in a way before that further horizon. So we're going to have to do some tidying when this is dry. We're going to tidy up the line of the sky. We're going to tidy up the edge of the rock so that we can see what's reflection, which is this lovely area here of shadow and reflection, and what's the rock. And then we're going to put a line to make the edge of the beach tidy. Now, I'm just going to put a little bit of detail onto the top of that rock again because I was silly and I drew an outline. You shouldn't really draw outlines. I did it so that you could see what I was doing. Just wanted to cover it up a little bit. And we'll add some texture to it. We'll add some birds in the sky. And we'll add some crap on the beach because there's always rubbish on the beach. And I mean bits of twig. I don't mean like sanitary towels and shit or whatever. I just mean little bits of detail. So I'll blot out any excess moisture I've got off the edge of the picture because we don't want that necessarily showing. I'm going to put that back in. Now there's a little bit of a back run there, as we would call it, where colours have mixed that I don't want to. Now if I just go over that with a damp brush, and I always dampen it with the background colour because it minimises disruption, I can get rid of it. Not a problem. You can lift ultramarine really easily. What you can't lift is phthalo blue. So if you have problems with phthalo blue, you're stuck with it. I'm going to darken up this wash because I'm not convinced this is really dark enough to give me what I want as shadow. I'll be able to cut off the bottom so it doesn't worry me that I've gone off the bottom of the picture. Now, I'm going to let that dry again, and it's going to have to dry completely. Just spotting in a bit more phthalo blue on the horizon on this side. I'm just trying to balance the horizon line a little bit because I find it really hard to just sort of go, no, let it dry, leave it. Because the phthalo blue sort of represents where there's a little bit of dappling of light on the ultramarine of the sea, I just wanted to get a bit in before it dried on each end so that it blended properly. So we've got this wet area of sea here. We will put some detail onto the wet area of the beach. We will clean the line here and make it very obvious where the beach ends and the sea begins, and that the sea is behind. And then we'll tidy up the edges of this rock, which is granulating beautifully now. And then we might add some birds into the sky if we so wish later. So this is going to have to dry again completely. Note the paper is a little bit wavy. That's fine. look at your paper, understand that it's wavy, and then you'll know when it's really, really dry. So again, 3 or 4 hours, total dryness, and then come back to it, and then we'll continue. Again, we can leave the paints. I'm working in a progressive way here. We had ultramarine when we needed ultramarine. I've now mixed it. I made a shadow, I used it. I added pink to it, I used it. That pink shadow we've got now is what we're going to use in other areas. If I need ultramarine again, I've still got a splodge there that's relatively clean. If you want to make sure it stays clean, wet a brush and clean round. There shouldn't be a need to, because there's so much pigment in that blob of paint, we can use it for ages. And what I've even done before now is when I've finished, I've cleaned out these, left these blobs of paint and got 3 or 4 more paintings out of it. So still got a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of raw sienna, and quite a bit of the other 3. I am actually quite wasteful when I use paint from the tube. I put out more than I ever use, but I just can't get it right. If you do ever want to get a really nice gradient, a little tip, put a bit more water in, and what you'll end up with is a very dark colour at this end, a very light colour at this end, and you can just go to different areas of the palette depending, because this end's deeper, so there's more water, and this end's got the pigment. You can get different shades just by doing it. We could add to the sky if we wanted to at this point. I know some people would. I probably wouldn't normally, but I'll show you what we could do. Is you take a little bit of that darker phthalo blue and you find the darker bits of the sky and you just sort of run it along, and you don't really settle anywhere. You just sort of add a bit of an indication on the shadow side of the cloud. Then you wet your brush and dry off most of the moisture and touch it on, and that will dilute those little spots, suck out a lot of the moisture and the paint with it, so you don't get the effect of just dark splodges. And then we can do a blend upwards. And it'll look very odd, but if you then blot it, and the camera probably won't pick this up very well, what that gives is just a tiny bit of texture on those clouds, and it can make quite a difference when we come to the end. So we'll leave that alone now, and we'll come back to it in a few hours when it's bone dry. We're about 3/4 of the way through this painting now, and all we have to do is tidy up, rescue out my little mistake here that actually I did deliberately. It's a teachable moment. Tidy up that beach, put some detritus on it, tidy up around that rock, and we've got a beautiful seascape with a fantastic sky. Hi again. I let this dry really thoroughly, several days again. Now you're going to have to excuse my pink hands. I've just been using some spray inks to do some art journaling for a product review, and I've now got pink hands, but I'm coming back to finish this off. So we left it at the stage before where we put some glazing on and we let it dry, and that's very preliminary glazing that we now need to blend out and do stuff with, really, and we might need to mix a few more colours along the way. My brushes are the same. I have got another brush there that I haven't used in this painting, and I'm still working with my size 8 round. A 6 or an 8 is really suitable for this sort of size painting. So I'm just wetting my brush with clean water, and what I'm doing is, where I'm doing this glazing on the beach to sort of indicate shadow, I'm just going to blend out that edge because it's a little bit hard and that looks unnatural. Now this is a very simple painting. The purpose of this painting is not to be a masterpiece. Probably wouldn't even be something you'd necessarily want to put on the wall. The idea was to teach you some techniques, and one of those techniques is blending out edges. When you do it, don't just blend over a small area, because when it dries, all you'll do is move the edge. It'll be paler, but you'll move it. So spread it out a long way, and it will give you a more natural fade, and that will give texture to that sandy beach area. Now, I'm happy with the sky. I think that's fine. What I'm not quite so happy about is around where this rock is, there's a little bit too much granulation. So the rock's a little bit too blue, not enough neutral. and the sea underneath has got too much reflection. It's got reflection in a huge area. So we'll soften that out a little bit and darken up that rock. So again with clean water, I'm going to go back to the mix I made to do that rock with, that sort of shadow mix of ultramarine, burnt sienna and permanent rose mixed together. And I'm just going to use, on dry paper, remember, I'm just going to redo the dark side of the rock so that it becomes darker than the sea. And I'm washing out my brush, and I'm going to go back to that sea colour, which was phthalo blue, and I'm probably going to add some ultramarine to it, but for now I'm just going to use that on its own, and I'm just going to paint very loosely a glaze of phthalo blue, because that will neutralise, well, not neutralise, it will do the opposite, it will blue eyes that area that didn't look quite right. And by glazing over the whole sea, it won't look like we've just plonked it over to cover up a mistake. And it's nice because we get a little bit of granulation coming through, a little bit of pink showing through here and there, and the sea looks a little bit more natural, because the sea isn't just blue, it's a mix of colours. We need to tidy up this line here, that horizon line, so I'm just going to run along with my brush and imagine a straight line, and I'm crap at doing this, so I will admit I very often end up moving the horizon up quite a lot because I can never get it perfect. And if you've got a rock, you must remember to get it level on both sides. There we go. Now at the bottom where the sea meets the beach, we had a little bleed of sandy colour into the sea. What I'm going to do is, with my brush loaded with phthalo blue, I'm just going to sort of gently, very gently scrub that area. And that'll lift and reactivate some of that very yellow that we had before. And you can see it's bleeding downwards just a tiny bit there. That's not a problem, because we will do a line across and we will move the sea. Because the level of the beach can be uneven. A beach can have a wobbly edge. It's bled down there because I've forgotten that was a little bit damp. So I'm just taking tissue. It's actually a dried out baby wipe, but it will work in the same way. Never rub, always just dot. And that will just lift out that area that was a problem. And I want to give a little bit more definition. And I'm bringing the beach down a bit at one end so you can see the sea behind it. Must blend up that colour to sort of mix it in. You can see the sea behind it, and here's the line of the sand of the beach. And we do want it to kind of come over, but this is too wet. And if we do it now, it'll just run downwards. So we're going to have to do that in a moment when it's dried out. I'm just painting right up to the edge. It's over. It would be tape, it's not taped, but it should be taped to tidy up that edge. I've got my brush wet and clean watered, and I'm just going to dry it on tissue because I want a thirsty brush. To make your brush thirsty, just dry it out. The way to dry it is to pinch it with tissue, and then without pinching it, just roll it to keep the shape, because you want to keep a nice point on this kind of brush. You want it to stay sharp, because then you can pick up small things. And I'm going to use that dry brush on the rock, on the side the sun is coming from, to lift out tiny bits. Apologies if you can hear the TV in the background. It's in another room. I've just left it on because I'm lazy, and my pets like television, so I leave it for them to watch. I'm just going to blot out some of that wetness, and I've left the dark just around that dark edge. The top can be dark because the sun's behind it, so that's quite normal. And when we're doing a painting, if you think about composition, what we've done here in terms of message, we've got a diagonal line here pointing. We've got diagonal lines in the sky, so everything's pointing this way. down at the bottom we've got a line pointing this way, we've got a line pointing this way, we've got a line pointing this way. If we'd done this line in this direction, it would have looked very false because we'd actually have an arrow pointing to the middle of the painting. That might look awkward. So by having a lot of things pointing in different directions, and where they roughly intersect is where our rock is, if we had wanted to do a ship or a person on a surfboard or whatever you want really, that's the place to put it. So when you're painting your sky, you know, you're at the mercy of the paper. The water ends up dictating how the clouds look. But once you've done that, that's when you decide, where do I put this in the painting? Don't come in with, we're going to have a rock here, we'll have sky. Put the sky in and then go, oh, okay, we've got lines facing this way, the rock's going to have to go here. That's how you would put them together. Now, if you're trying to paint an actual real place where there really is a rock in a certain position, that's not a problem really, because unless you're painting detail on the shore, you could be looking at the rock from any angle. So the angle you paint it at will dictate the view. Just taking a slightly dampened brush again, and I'm going into the permanent rose just to re-wet what's on my palette. These have been dried for over a week and they're perfectly fine. I just want to add a bit more pink into the area where the pink sky from the sunset is reflecting, and it's going to look really fake, like I've put way too much on. And you're right, that's because that's exactly what I've done. The reason is that the paper behind is wet with phthalo blue still, and I want to put on so much that it will soak in a tiny bit. What I'm then going to do is kind of a sort of glazing and reverse glazing. I'm going to peel off and I'm going to paint on. So with a wet brush, I'm not touching the whole thing, touching in dribs and drabs, so I'm picking up some and not others. That will soften it in a natural way. If I'd lifted all of it, it would look very flat. Taking that phthalo blue, and I'm making sure it's quite a dark wash. A little bit darker than I've been using actually. I'm going to start over here where the paper's just damp and just glaze over. Squeeze it out, and with a fairly dry brush lift out some of that phthalo blue because I put too much on. Go back to my pink. There we go. That's sort of the amounts I want. Not too dark, not too light. I now need to attend to this area here, and this area here was done with permanent rose, which I'm going to just put some into my palette, quite dark. Sorry, I had a low power mode indicator there, I didn't realise that had come on. Over here, and a little bit of my phthalo blue in with it, and that gives us that lovely dark, almost mysterious purple that one can get. And I want more pink in that. I want it to be grey. There's a sort of family of grey purples, and that's the one I want. And that, always be careful not to drip water on your painting when you bring your brush across. That with a lot of water gives us a delicious shadow colour, because this area is rather flat. So what I want to do is put some shadow around these light patches and add some detritus. So first of all, I'm just going to paint in some random splodges, keeping in the direction that the water has probably been flowing up the beach. And down in this corner, things would be darker naturally, so I might just make more rubbish in that area. And then I'm going to need a smaller brush. So for the first time, I'm going to move to a detail brush. You always move to the small brushes actually at the end, and a lot of people make the mistake of going small too soon. And I've got a size 2 round. It's just an acrylic one that's not going to take, it's a nylon actually. It's a nylon brush that won't take up much colour. And I'm just going to use that to just add along the inside of each of these little light areas a tiny bit of shadow. I'm going to use the same shadow colour with the same little brush on the dark side of the rock. Remember, the rock actually, it isn't above the horizon, it goes below it as well. And I've done around the edge and around the bottom, and I'm blending out by really just sort of flicking. I love that shade of purple. It's a really beautiful way to get a purple, and I'm going to use that actually to define the edge of the beach, because the light's behind it, so it could legitimately be in shadow. And it's going to be less harsh than using a black or a neutral. And I'm going to use my little brush again with lots of water. Just wetted it, and I'm just going to bring downwards. Now you could be using any brush for this. It doesn't have to be a synthetic like I'm using. I just like, when I'm using a little brush, I don't like it to take up much paint, because it's important to have control. So that's why. And I'm just using it with water to blend that line down, and it will look very odd, terribly false at the moment. But it will be okay, I promise. So I've just cleaned and dried that brush, and I'm going to again infiltrate with my tissue, dab out the excess moisture, because all I want is that line. Now there's one area where I'm going to need to apply some more colour. Don't know whether you can really see, because I'm obviously able to see this much more close up than you guys are, because I'm right down on top of the picture. I need more colour just here, because I need to hide a join between the sea and the sand, and that's something you can play with. I mean, this is a teachable painting, it's not a masterpiece. There we go. Putting it into wet area is actually much easier for this colour to make it work. And that looks like water coming onto the beach actually, which matches that area. So why don't we, teachable moment, let's join the two areas together so that we've got water coming along the whole beach and then kind of turning at the end. I like that better. Compositionally it's nicer. Need to add much more shadow to this dark area though. Don't be afraid to really think about colour, because the water coming onto the beach isn't going to be bright blue because it's not reflecting the sky. It's going to be in partial shadow. And this little brush is really perfect for just getting in between the detail that's already there and just adding a little bit more. I now want to add some detail to the sea. I just want to add some of that purple again, and I'm just going to put, where the paper's still damp, I'm just going to pop a little bit on, because it will add texture. You'll hardly see it because it's a very thin translucent glaze. Where I've gone a bit too dark, I intervene with tissue again, and that will dry and leave a very, very pale mark. Now, we need a seagull because it's the law that you have one if you paint a seascape. So what I will do is pop one in, probably up here, and I'm just going to do the traditional V-shaped kind of one. And to do that, I'm going to take some of the permanent rose, very thick and dark, and I think I'm mixing it where, yeah, you can't see this mix, sorry. And I'm going to take some of that wonderful shadow mix I had, the ultramarine burnt sienna mix, and mix in some of that permanent rose. The rationale being that I can make just a really dark shadow colour that's got a bit of texture to it, so that when it dries the gull doesn't look totally flat. So I've just mixed the same kind of shadow colour I've been using all along, purely because, even though you'll barely see it, it'll just mean that it coordinates. If I made it too dark, it wouldn't look right. Shall we give it a friend? I always put a bit of detail in the bird, like under the wings. I think it helps. So that's a very simple little seascape. Didn't take that long to paint. We've done a bit of glazing. We've done some just letting the water flow and taking us where it wants to take us. We've done some adding texture. We've done some making changes when things don't quite work. And now what we need to do is do a little tidy of the edges. Now, I put tape on 2 edges here. I did not put tape on these edges, so you can see the difference the tape will make. To take the tape off, you need to peel it really carefully. The best way to do it is to kind of work sideways and make sure the paper is dry. Now, this is a really cheap masking tape, and cheap masking tape, in my view, is actually better because it comes off really easily. So you can see I've got a lovely, neat, crisp white border, and on these sides I don't. So this would have to be trimmed if I was going to want to frame it. That lovely crisp white border, I think, really makes a painting come together. It makes it come forwards. So it's always a good idea to just put some tape, even in a sketchbook. I think it makes a world of difference. So that was a nice, simple little seascape. Now, next time in episode 4 of the Spin Doctor Surgery, we are going to use masking fluid. Now, I said last time we were going to use it this time. I changed my mind because I wanted to cover some glazing and some other techniques. There are many masking fluids out there on the market. There are all sorts of different versions of it. You can get one that comes like this in a fine liner bottle that you squeeze. You can get it that just comes in little bottles sort of like this, that you know, looks like white gunge that you paint on with a brush. If you're going to do that, you're also going to need a colour shaper because it's not advisable to use your brushes with it. Now, the one that I prefer, and I have no kind of, I'm not going to get money from Pebeo for this, Pebeo's Drawing Gum is my favourite one because it goes on blue, so you can see where you've put it, and it dries black, so you know when it's dry, you know where it is. It makes life really, really easy. You need something called a colour shaper as well, which is like a silicone brush that makes putting masking fluid on really easy. I will put a link in the description of this video to both the drawing gum and a colour shaper so that you can get hold of them if you want to follow along, and then next time you can paint with us. Now, I use professional grade tube colours for this painting. You can still use your Cotman set or your pans or whatever. Just make your mixes in a normal way. The only reason I was using tube colours is it was just easier for filming purposes to just have the colours that I wanted to show on display. But you could do this with anything. Now, please, if you painted this painting, please post it in the comments, post a link to it, and I'll look at it and do exactly what I've been doing all along. I will tell you, oh, if you've got anything that didn't quite work, I'll help you get it right. This is a really nice little painting if you want to do a technique that I'm really fond of when you're kind of learning, and that is that you take the same painting and once a week you repaint it. And every time you'll get better, and every time you'll learn from your mistakes. This is a really easy one for doing that with. Even if you omitted the beach and just kind of did that. Lovely little painting, you could give it as a gift. It's a really straightforward one. Don't forget, always sign your painting. So I will sign this one, and I tend to sign them where I want to sign them, and I don't sign my name, I just sign my initial and the year. 2017, how did that happen? It's gone very fast, hasn't it, the last year. Let's hope 2017 is somehow better than 2016 was for everybody. Now, my rules are on paintings from Spin Doctor's Surgery. You can use them, you can give them as gifts, you can sell them. If you're going to use them to teach with, if you want to use this in a class or a painting group or a painting party, please credit my channel, link to my channel. If you want to use this video for teaching purposes, you can do that. It's licensed under Creative Commons. Just look at the licensing information on it. But please make sure you must accredit me. And the official accreditation is The Spin Doctor, written as 3 words. Okay? That's the correct way to acknowledge my videos. Thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed painting along with me, and show me your derivations of this. Do different versions of it. Put a pirate ship in, put a whale's tail in. Make it interesting and make it your own. Thank you all very much, and good evening.